The rain was coming down harder now, soaking through the thin leather of my flats. Each step sent a shiver through my toes. I should have called a cab, but pride kept me walking, as if moving my legs could keep me from collapsing under the weight of everything that had just been taken from me. The box dug into my arms awkward and heavy, the corners pressing red lines into my skin. I ducked into a narrow cafe a few blocks away, the bell above the door chiming faintly. The warmth hit me immediately, along with the smell of coffee and pastries. The barista glanced up, his expression shifting when he saw my drenched hair and the soggy cardboard box in my arms. He didn't ask questions. He just nodded toward an empty corner table. I slid into the chair, set the box down, and rubbed my hands together, trying to chase the chill away. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a message. Ethan. How's your day? I might be home late. My jaw tightened. He had no idea, or maybe he did and simply didn't care. I typed a reply, then deleted it. I had nothing to say that would not sound like a cry for help, and I had begged for enough scraps of attention already. The barista approached quietly and set down a cup of coffee. On the house, he said softly. I looked up startled. You look like you need it. His kindness nearly undid me. I managed a thank you, wrapping both hands around the mug, letting the heat seep into my palms. I stared into the dark liquid, my reflection distorted in the surface. I remembered the first time I walked into Westbridge Technologies 4 years ago, eager and certain I would climb higher than anyone expected. My mother had scoffed at the idea, calling it a placeholder job, until I married someone successful. I had promised myself I would prove her wrong, and for a while I thought I was doing exactly that. Claire's face rose unbidden in my mind. Her sly comments in meetings, her exaggerated sighs whenever I spoke, the way she dropped by my desk with fake concern. I should have seen it sooner. I should have documented every word, every strange shift in her reports. Instead, I trusted the system. And now, I was the one cast out. A couple at the next table laughed, their voices bright and careless. I envied their ease. My chest felt tight, as though invisible hands were squeezing the air from my lungs. I took a long sip of the coffee, bitter and grounding, and tried to breathe. When I finally left the cafe, the rain had thinned to a drizzle. The box was lighter now, 1 or 2 items left behind in the trash where I had decided they belonged. I walked slowly toward the subway entrance, the neon lights reflecting in the wet pavement. People rushed past me, umbrellas bobbing like dark flowers. To them, I was just another soaked stranger, indistinguishable in the crowd. At the top of the stairs, I paused, staring down into the tunnel. The roar of an approaching train echoed up, vibrating through the soles of my shoes. I tightened my grip on the box and descended each step heavy. On the platform, I set the box at my feet and leaned against the cold tile wall. A man in a wrinkled suit glanced at me, then at the box. "Rough day?" he asked with a weary half-smile. I let out a short laugh, humorless. "Something like that." He nodded as if he understood without needing details. Maybe he did. This city was full of people carrying boxes, some literal, some invisible. The train screeched into the station, and I picked up my belongings again. Inside the car, I found a seat and balanced the box on my lap. I looked at the framed photo of Grandma, inside her smile, steady and kind. For a moment, the chaos of the day softened. She had always believed in me when no one else did. I whispered to the picture as if she could hear me. I don't know what to do now. The train rattled forward, lights flickering as it plunged into the tunnel. Around me, people scrolled through phones, read books, closed their eyes to doze. I sat there with my box of remnants, the weight of failure pressing on my shoulders, and wondered how I would explain all this to my family. By the time I emerged back onto the street in Queens, the sky had darkened. The rain had stopped, but the air was heavy, damp with the scent of asphalt and exhaust. My apartment loomed ahead, the brick facade chipped and weathered. I climbed the stairs, fumbled with my keys, and stepped into the dim hallway. Inside my apartment, silence greeted me. I set the box on the table and kicked off my soaked shoes. The room felt smaller than ever, the walls closing in. I pulled the photo of Grandma from the box and placed it on the shelf, then sank onto the couch. The events of the day replayed in my head, sharp and unrelenting. The HR manager's cold eyes, Claire's smug certainty, the pitying stares of colleagues, my mother's inevitable scorn when she found out, and Ethan absent as always, drifting further from me with each passing day. I pressed the heels of my palms into my eyes, willing myself not to cry again. My body ached with exhaustion, but my mind would not stop racing. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the humiliation and grief, a spark of anger flickered. Not the wild, destructive kind, but the steady flame that could guide me out of this darkness. I stood, finally walked to the kitchen, and poured a glass of water. The photo of Grandma seemed to watch me from the shelf. I held the glass tightly, grounding myself in the simple act of standing upright, breathing, refusing to collapse. The day had stripped me bare. My career was gone, my reputation tainted, my future uncertain. But as I stared out the rain-streaked window at the city lights flickering against the night, one thought settled deep in my chest. This would not be the end of me. The invitation had arrived weeks before, thick cream paper embossed with gold lettering announcing my parents' annual family dinner in Greenwich. It was not optional. Margaret Carter did not extend invitations. She issued commands. That evening I drove up the highway, the city lights fading behind me as sprawling estates rose on either side of the road. My chest tightened with every mile. The Carter house loomed at the end of the driveway, brick and glass, spotless and imposing. I parked beside Daniel's gleaming black Tesla and took a deep breath before stepping out into the cool night air. Through the tall windows I could already see my mother arranging herself at the head of the table, her wine glass glinting beneath the chandelier. My father sat quietly beside her, expression unreadable as ever. Inside, the dining room smelled of roasted duck and expensive wine. The table was set with silver candlesticks and bone china, the kind only brought out for occasions when appearances mattered most. Margaret's eyes found me instantly sharp and assessing the way one might examine a crack in the porcelain. "You are late," she said flatly, though I was not. I forced a smile and slipped into my seat across from Daniel. My brother looked away quickly, fiddling with his cufflinks. Dinner began in silence, the clinking of cutlery the only sound. I tried to eat, but each bite turned to ash in my mouth. Margaret waited until the second course before beginning her performance. She set down her fork, dabbed her lips with a napkin, and turned toward me. "I heard about what happened at Westbridge," she said, her voice carrying easily across the table. "Fired, was it not?" The knife in my hand trembled slightly. I set it down carefully. "It was not my fault," I said. "There were politics involved." "Politics," Margaret repeated as though tasting the word and finding it bitter. "Excuses. You were always too soft for that world. I told your father this job would not last." Richard shifted in his chair but said nothing. His silence was a fortress my mother had always hidden behind. I looked at Daniel, hoping for some flicker of support, but he kept his eyes fixed on his plate. Margaret leaned forward, her voice rising. "Do you realize what people will think of us? That our daughter cannot even hold a position at a mid-level firm? Do you know the embarrassment you bring to the Carter name?" My face burned. I swallowed hard, willing myself not to cry. "I worked harder than anyone there," I said quietly. She laughed, sharp and cold. "Hard work is meaningless if you have nothing to show for it. Look at Daniel." All eyes turned to my brother. He cleared his throat, cheeks coloring. His promotion had been announced just last month. Senior financial strategist at a Manhattan firm. The pride of the family. Margaret raised her glass, the crystal catching the light. To Daniel she declared, "Our only true accomplishment." The room echoed with the chime of glassware as everyone but me lifted their drinks. My hand remained frozen on the table, fingers curled tight. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my gaze. The humiliation sat heavy in my chest, each word from my mother, a stone piled higher. I wanted to stand, to scream, to demand why my worth had always been measured against impossible expectations. But the words caught in my throat. Instead, I sat there listening as she praised Daniel's achievements, her voice sweetened with pride that she had never once offered me. I thought of the years I had spent chasing their approval of the sacrifices, the nights alone at the office, the desperate hope that one day they would see me. Margaret's eyes flicked back to me, her smile sharp. You should learn from your brother. He understands how to bring honor to this family. The conversation around the table resumed light and shallow, as though nothing had happened. I could barely hear it over the rush of blood in my ears. My father discussed golf with an Uncle Daniel's fiancée, chattered about wedding venues. My mother laughed at a cousin's joke. And I sat there invisible, humiliated, a ghost at my own family's table. At one point, Daniel's gaze met mine. There was something almost apologetic in his eyes, but he looked away before I could read it fully. I forced myself to take another bite of food, though my stomach twisted. The flavors were lost on me. All I could taste was shame. When dessert was served, Margaret leaned back in her chair, satisfied. She had done what she came to do. The message was clear, carved into the silence that followed her words. I was the disappointment, the failure, the one to be tolerated, not celebrated. As coffee was poured and laughter filled the room again, I sat in stillness, my hands clenched in my lap. My mother's toast echoed in my head, louder than the clinking of cups, louder than the chatter of relatives. To Daniel, our only true accomplishment. I excused myself quietly and stepped out into the cold night. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. I closed my eyes, inhaling deeply, trying to steady the storm inside me. Behind me, the house glowed with warmth and laughter, but it was not my warmth. It had never been mine. The gravel crunched beneath my shoes as I walked toward my car, each step pulling me farther from their voices. My hands trembled on the steering wheel as I sat there in the dark headlights cutting across the manicured lawn. I gripped the wheel tighter, my mother's words repeating in my mind, slicing deeper with every echo. A failure, an embarrassment, invisible beside Daniel's shining star. I started the engine, the sound loud in the stillness, and drove down the long driveway. The mansion shrank in my rearview mirror, its lights glowing like distant stars. I kept driving, the night swallowing me whole. The traffic lights blurred red and green across the wet windshield as I drove back toward Queens, but I was not ready to go home. My apartment felt suffocating, and Ethan had texted earlier that he would be home late. The message replayed in my head, hollow and vague, and something inside me twisted with suspicion. My hands tightened on the wheel until my knuckles whitened. Instead of turning toward my neighborhood, I kept driving into Manhattan, following a pull I could not explain. The streets were alive with weekend noise, people spilling out of bars, taxis, honking music drifting from open doors. It all felt distant to me, as if I were moving inside a glass bubble, the world outside muted. I pulled up outside the Lexington Grand Hotel, a place Ethan had mentioned before in passing, always with a too casual tone. My stomach knotted as I parked a block away and walked slowly to the entrance, the night air sharp against my skin. The lobby doors swished open, and the smell of polished marble and perfume rushed over me. I hesitated, my pulse hammering. At the front desk, a young clerk greeted me politely. I forced a calm smile and asked if Ethan Carter had checked in. The clerk glanced at his screen, then gave a professional nod, confirming what I had both feared and expected. My mouth went dry. I thanked him and walked toward the elevator as though my legs were not made of lead. On the 12th floor, the carpet muffled my footsteps. I scanned the numbers until I reached the door. 1208. My hand hovered over the handle before I raised it and knocked. Silence at first, then a muffled laugh, unmistakably Ethan's. My chest clenched. When the door opened, the sight knocked the breath from me. Ethan stood there shirtless, his hair mussed, his expression freezing as his eyes met mine. Behind him, Sophie lounged against the bed, her silky dress slipping from one shoulder, a smile playing on her lips. The betrayal was so vivid, so undeniable, that for a second, the hallway spun around me. Olivia, Ethan said, his tone flat, almost bored. "What are you doing here?" I stared at him, my throat burning. "What am I doing here? What are you doing here?" "Ethan." Sophie laughed lightly, as if this were a comedy. I felt heat flood my face, shame and fury tangling in my chest. I demanded, "Do you have anything to say to me?" Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his expression cool. "You knew this was coming. You've been a ghost in our marriage for months. You lost your job, you bring nothing home but bitterness. What reason do I have to stay?" The words sliced deeper than I imagined possible. I could barely breathe. I whispered, choking, "After everything we built." He shrugged, unbothered. "There is nothing left to build." Behind him, Sophie's smirk widened. My hands trembled at my sides, and I felt the box of emotions I had held together all day crack open at once. Anger, grief, humiliation, every wound layered on top of the last. I took one step back, then another. Ethan did not follow. Neither did he close the door. He just stood there watching me as though I were nothing more than an inconvenience interrupting his night. My legs moved on their own, carrying me down the hall. The carpet blurred, the walls closed in. I stumbled into the elevator, pressed the lobby button, and collapsed against the mirrored wall. My reflection looked pale and hollow, eyes wide with disbelief. The ride down felt endless. By the time the doors opened onto the lobby, I had no tears left. Only a numb emptiness that spread through my chest. I walked past the desk clerk, who gave me a curious glance out into the night, where the city lights burned too brightly against the dark. The air hit me cold and sharp, but it could not clear the fog in my head. I kept walking without direction down streets buzzing with life I could not feel part of. Each step echoed with Ethan's words. Nothing left to build. When I finally reached my car, I sat behind the wheel and stared at my hands. They were shaking violently, the steering wheel slick under my palms. I thought of my mother's voice calling me a failure, of Ethan's indifference, of Sophie's smile. It was all the same story written again and again. I turned the key and the engine roared to life. The city spread before me, neon and steel, but I felt none of its energy. I drove with no plan, just to move to keep from collapsing under the weight pressing down on me. The streets blurred, headlights streaking across my vision, until finally I pulled over near the river, the water black and restless under the bridge. I sat there in silence, the sound of rushing water filling the night. My hands unclenched slowly, my breath shaky. Somewhere inside, the numbness, a small voice rose. Not this. Not like this. They would not break me completely. I leaned back against the seat, closing my eyes, the cold seeping into my bones. The night wrapped around me, heavy and endless. For now, there was only this pause, this hollow space where the world felt far away, and I was left alone with the ruin of what had been my life. Rain began again as I left the car and wandered through the streets. The sky had split open, water pouring down in heavy sheets that soaked me within seconds. My hair clung to my face, my coat grew heavier with every step, but I kept walking as if the storm could wash away the taste of betrayal clinging to me. Neon signs flickered above storefronts, their colors bleeding into the puddles at my feet. My shoes squelched with each step, but I could not bring myself to stop. On a corner near an alley, I collided with someone, nearly stumbling to the ground. A rough hand caught my arm, steadying me. When I looked up, I saw a man with weathered skin and tired eyes, clothes hanging in tatters. His voice was hoarse as he muttered, "Careful now." I stepped back, mumbling an apology, when he bent and picked something up from the wet pavement. It was my wallet. I had not even realized it had fallen. He pressed it into my hand with a faint smile. "You dropped this." For a moment I just stared at him, rain dripping from his brow, his thin frame trembling from the cold. My throat tightened. "Thank you," I whispered. He nodded already, turning back toward the alley where a piece of cardboard leaned against the wall for shelter. I stood there clutching the wallet, tears blurring the streetlights. Of all people, it was someone who had nothing who reminded me I still had something left. The weight of my losses was real, but I had a roof, a bed, a place to return to. Shame and gratitude tangled in my chest until I could hardly breathe. By the time I reached my apartment, the storm had eased, but inside my heart, the flood still raged. I tossed my soaked coat onto the floor, poured a glass of wine with shaking hands, and sat in the dark living room. The city hummed faintly through the windows, but I felt miles away from it all. I sipped the wine, its sharp burn doing nothing to steady me. My hands would not stop trembling. The doorbell rang once, startling me. I ignored it, but then it rang again, followed by a soft voice. Olivia, it's me. I opened the door to find Emily standing there, her umbrella dripping her face full of concern. She stepped inside without waiting, pulled me into a hug, and I finally let the tears come. She held me tightly, murmuring, I heard. I am so sorry. We sank onto the couch, the half-empty glass of wine still on the table. She glanced at it, then at me, her expression firm but gentle. This is not the answer, Liv. I shook my head, my voice cracking. I lost everything. My job, my marriage, even my family turned their backs tonight. Emily squeezed my hand. You still have people who love you. And you still have your grandmother. At the mention of Grandma Rose, something flickered inside me. I had not seen her in months, caught up in the chaos of work and Ethan's demands. Memories of her soft voice, her unwavering faith in me, surfaced like fragile lanterns in the dark. Emily smiled faintly. She always believed you were stronger than all of them. Maybe it is time you remembered that. Before I could reply, my phone buzzed on the table. The name lit up the screen and my breath caught. Grandma Rose. With shaking fingers, I answered, my voice unsteady. Hello? Her voice, though weaker with age, carried warmth that cut through the cold in me. Olivia, sweetheart, I heard about what happened. Come see me tomorrow at the Westchester house. There is something important I need to tell you. Tears welled again, but this time they were not only from sorrow. Yes, Grandma, I will come. She chuckled softly. Good. We will talk then. Rest tonight. When the call ended, I sat in silence, the phone still pressed to my ear. Emily watched me, eyes questioning. She wants to see me, I whispered. Tomorrow. Emily nodded. Then you go. You listen. Maybe this is the start of something new. I leaned back against the couch, exhausted, the storm outside finally fading into a light drizzle. The glass of wine remained untouched as I set it aside. For the first time that night, the crushing weight on my chest loosened just enough for me to breathe. The city lights blinked faintly through the rain-streaked window as I closed my eyes, letting the quiet wrap around me. Somewhere beyond the grief and betrayal, hope stirred, fragile, but alive. And tomorrow, I would face it. Morning light filtered through thin curtains when I woke, my body heavy, but my mind restless. The memory of Grandma Rose's voice lingered like a fragile thread pulling me forward. I dressed quickly, choosing a dark sweater and jeans, something simple, something that would not distract from the weight of what lay ahead. By the time I reached Westchester, the city had receded behind me, the skyline replaced by rolling hills and tall oaks bending in the wind. The Carter estate stood at the end of a winding driveway, ivy climbing its stone walls, the same house where I had spent countless childhood summers. The windows glowed with a warmth I had forgotten, and for the first time in days, I felt an urge to knock rather than collapse. When the butler opened the door, I was led to the sunroom where Grandma sat in her favorite armchair, a blanket across her knees, her silver hair pulled back neatly. She smiled when she saw me, her eyes soft, yet shadowed by fatigue. Olivia, darling, you came. I bent down to hug her, inhaling the faint scent of lavender that always clung to her. Her skin felt thinner than I remembered, her grip weaker, but her presence steadied me. Of course I came, Grandma. I've missed you. She patted my hand, her gaze searching mine. I know things have been hard for you. I am sorry for the pain this family has caused, but there is something more I need to tell you. Before I could ask, the door opened, and a man in a gray suit stepped inside, briefcase in hand. He introduced himself as David Hall, her attorney. My heart quickened, sensing the gravity of what was coming. Grandma's voice trembled, yet her words carried clarity. Olivia, I do not have much time left. The doctors tell me it is stage 4 cancer. The air seemed to drain from the room. I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. No, Grandma. Please. She squeezed my hand gently. Sweetheart, do not cry. I have lived a full life. What matters now is what I leave behind. David opened the briefcase and laid several documents on the small table beside her chair. He adjusted his glasses and spoke with calm authority. Mrs. Carter has instructed me to transfer ownership of the Rose Arts Foundation entirely into your name, effective immediately. The foundation is valued at approximately $15 million. My mind spun words caught in my throat. I looked from him to her, barely able to comprehend. Grandma? Why me? Because she said softly, you are the only one I trust to carry forward what I built. Your mother and brother see only money. You see people. You always did. Her eyes shone with quiet pride, and something inside me cracked open. For so long I had been dismissed, ridiculed, stripped of worth by the very people who should have protected me. And here she was, handing me everything. David slid a pen across the papers. These documents have been notarized. With your signature, the foundation is legally yours. My hands shook as I signed each stroke of ink, pressing deeper into the truth. When it was done, David collected the pages and closed his briefcase. Congratulations, Ms. Carter. You are now the sole chairwoman of the Rose Arts Foundation. The room blurred through my tears. I leaned forward, pressing my forehead against Grandma's hand. Thank you, Grandma. I do not deserve this. Yes, you do, she whispered firmly. You have been overlooked too long. Let this remind you that you are not a failure. I stayed there for a long moment, letting her words sink in. For the first time in years, I felt seen, believed and cherished. The bitterness that had coated my heart loosened just slightly, replaced with something fragile, but powerful. Emily's voice echoed in my memory. She always believed you were stronger than all of them. Grandma gave a small nod toward the window where sunlight broke through the clouds. Use this gift wisely, Olivia. Not for revenge, not for pride, but for the life you were meant to lead. I promised her I would, though. Deep inside, I knew the lines between justice and revenge were already blurring. David rose to leave, assuring he would file everything by the afternoon. Once the door closed behind him, silence filled the room, except for the faint ticking of a clock. Grandma's hand remained in mine, her gaze lingering on me with both sadness and strength. I am tired now, but I am at peace knowing this is in your hands. I nodded, unable to speak without my voice breaking. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing slow and steady. The weight of the papers in my bag was almost unbearable, not from their physical heft, but from the responsibility they carried. $15 million a legacy, a chance at redemption. I sat with her until the shadows grew longer, memorizing every line of her face, every detail of the home that felt both foreign and familiar. My chest ached with grief for what she was losing, and yet it swelled with gratitude for what she had given me. When I finally stood to leave, she held my hand one last time. Remember, Olivia, strength is not in wealth, it is in knowing who you are. I swallowed hard, kissed her cheek and stepped back into the hallway. The house seemed quieter, the air heavier, but I carried something new inside me. Outside, the sun was setting over the trees, casting the sky in gold. I paused on the steps, clutching the bag close, my heart pounding with the enormity of what had just changed. The gravel crunched under my shoes as I walked to my car, the weight of the documents pulling at my shoulder like an anchor. I thought I would have time to breathe, to let the gift settle in my chest before the world found out. I was wrong. By the time I reached Manhattan, the whispers had already started. My phone buzzed with messages, half from curious acquaintances, half from numbers I did not recognize. News traveled fast when money was involved, and $15 million was the kind of number that made even strangers feel entitled to an opinion. 2 days later, Margaret called for a family meeting at the mansion in Greenwich. Her voice on the phone was clipped icy, leaving no room for refusal. I drove there with my stomach knotted, knowing full well what awaited me. The driveway was crowded with sleek cars, and when I stepped inside, I felt the tension pressing against the walls like storm clouds. Margaret was already seated at the head of the long dining table, pearls around her neck, her posture stiff and unforgiving. Richard sat beside her, staring down at his folded hands. Daniel lingered near the corner, avoiding my eyes. And then, as if fate were determined to twist the knife, Ethan walked in with Sophie on his arm. She wore a scarlet dress too bright for the occasion, her smile sharp, designed to wound. Margaret wasted no time. "So this is what you've been hiding, Olivia? Preying on a sick old woman's sentimentality, convincing her to sign over her foundation. How low can you go?" The words stung, but I forced myself to remain steady. Grandma made her decision of her own free will. She trusted me. Ethan let out a laugh, cruel and loud. A failure playing dress-up as a savior. Sophie squeezed his hand and smirked. "It almost looks convincing, doesn't it?" I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, but refused to look away. The weight of their eyes was suffocating, yet somewhere deep inside the papers in my bag gave me strength. For the first time, I was not empty-handed. Margaret's voice sharpened like glass. "That foundation was meant for the family, for Daniel, not for you to parade around with. You will return it immediately." I straightened my shoulders. "No, I will not. The foundation is legally mine. And I intend to honor Grandma's vision, not twist it into a vanity project." Sophie laughed softly. "Listen to her. She actually thinks she matters now." Ethan leaned forward, his eyes cold. "You don't have the spine for this. You will crumble like you always do." The room spun with their jeers, their venom threading together into one chorus of contempt. But beneath the noise, a steady voice rose inside me, Grandma's voice reminding me of who I was. I looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes one by one. "You no longer have control over me. Not you, not any of you." The silence that followed cracked like thunder. Margaret's lips parted in outrage. Richard's hand twitched, but he said nothing. Daniel's eyes flickered with something unreadable, maybe shame, maybe regret. Ethan scoffed, pushing back his chair. "Let's see how long you last once the press digs into your so-called foundation. They'll eat you alive." Sophie added, "And when they do, don't come crawling back." I stood, my heart pounding, but my voice steady. "I won't crawl back. Not now. Not ever." For a moment no one moved, the weight of my words hanging heavy in the air. Then Margaret slammed her glass against the table, the liquid inside spilling like blood across the polished wood. "Get out of my house." I did not flinch. I picked up my bag and walked to the door, each step firmer than the last. Behind me the voices rose again, sharp and bitter, but they no longer pierced me the way they once had. Outside the night was cold, the air filled with the faint scent of pine from the trees lining the driveway. I exhaled slowly, realizing I had not taken a full breath inside that house. For the first time in my life, I had spoken without fear. As I reached my car, my phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Emily. I heard what happened. "Meet me tomorrow. We need to talk about your next move." I sat behind the wheel, the mansion's lights glaring in the rearview mirror like watchful eyes. My pulse still hammered in my ears, but beneath it a strange calm had taken root. The storm had broken, and though I stood alone in its wake, I was no longer powerless. I gripped the steering wheel, the papers beside me rustling like a promise. Whatever they threw at me next, I would be ready. The next morning, sunlight streamed through my apartment blinds, sharp and unforgiving. Yet it carried something different from the nights before. It carried possibility. I sat at my small kitchen table with a cup of black coffee papers from Rose Arts Foundation spread before me like an uncharted map. For the first time in weeks, I did not feel like a bystander to my own life. I was holding the wheel, even if the road ahead was unknown. Emily arrived not long after, her hair pulled back in a neat bun, laptop tucked under her arm. She tossed her coat onto the chair and looked at me with that practical determination she always carried. "So, boss, where do we start?" Her word boss made me laugh, the sound foreign on my lips. I am hardly that. But the warmth in her smile anchored me. "We start with vision," I said. "Grandma wanted this foundation to support emerging artists, to give voices a stage that money usually buys. We keep it pure." Emily nodded and began typing, already sketching out frameworks for outreach, grant applications, partnerships. Watching her made me breathe easier. I was not alone in this. By the end of the week, we had turned my apartment into a makeshift office, stacks of folders lined against the wall, sticky notes crowding the fridge door. Exhaustion clung to me, but so did a strange exhilaration. At night I would lie in bed and imagine Grandma's voice steady and proud, urging me forward. One afternoon, as Emily sorted through potential artist portfolios, my phone rang. It was James Bennett, a journalist I had met briefly at a charity event years ago. His voice carried that same mix of curiosity and sharpness. "I heard about what happened, Olivia, about the foundation. Would you be willing to talk?" I hesitated, nerves twisting my stomach. I knew what exposure meant. It meant scrutiny, judgment, headlines that could cut both ways. But then I thought of Margaret's words, of Ethan's laugh, of Sophie's smirk. If I wanted to claim this new chapter, I could not hide. "Yes," I said finally. "I will talk." We met at a small cafe downtown. James listened more than he spoke, his pen moving quickly across the page. I told him about Grandma's dream, about giving artists the chance she never had when she was young. I did not mention Margaret or Ethan or Sophie. This story was not about them. It was about carrying a legacy with integrity. When I finished, James set down his pen. "People are going to want to read this, Olivia. It is not just a foundation. It is a story about resilience." 2 days later, the article appeared in the New York Times. Emily burst into my apartment with the paper in hand, her eyes wide. "You made it! Look!" The headline read, "Carter Heiress Revives Legacy with Bold Arts Foundation." My name sat in ink that thousands would read with their morning coffee. I held the paper with trembling fingers, both terrified and exhilarated. That evening, my phone buzzed nonstop with messages. Old acquaintances congratulated me, some with genuine warmth, others with veiled curiosity. Daniel sent a brief text. "Nice work." I stared at the words, unsure of the tone behind them, but it was the first message from him in months. I looked out my window at the city glowing beneath the night sky. The recognition was real, but I knew it was fragile, the kind that could vanish with one wrong step. This was only the beginning. Still, for the first time in years, I felt the ground firm beneath my feet. I folded the newspaper carefully, placed it on the table, and whispered into the quiet room. "Grandma, I hope I am making you proud." The hum of the city drifted in through the window, a reminder that tomorrow would bring its storms. But tonight, I let myself breathe. The ballroom of the St. Regis in Manhattan glittered with crystal chandeliers, the light bouncing across marble floors, polished to a mirror shine. My reflection caught in those tiles as I walked toward the stage dress, brushing against my heels, nerves coiling tight in my stomach. Emily gave my hand a quick squeeze before slipping into the crowd, her eyes telling me I could do this. The air hummed with voices. Donors, artists, critics, and journalists gathered beneath the vaulted ceiling. Waiters carried trays of champagne, the clinking glasses forming a kind of overture before the night's performance. For that was what it felt like, a performance, except the script was mine, and the story belonged to Grandma Rose. When I stepped to the podium, the noise dimmed. Faces turned expectant, weighing whether I would stumble or rise. I adjusted the microphone, my fingers trembling only slightly, and took a breath. Tonight, we honor not just the beginning of Rose Arts Foundation, but the spirit of a woman who believed art could heal and elevate lives. My grandmother, Rose Carter, believed even one voice, one brushstroke, one melody could shift the world. I felt my throat tighten as I unfolded a small piece of paper. On it were the words she had spoken to me during our last afternoon together, the words I had promised to carry forward. She told me, "Olivia, you are stronger than they will ever admit, and your strength will not come from anger, but from what you choose to build." The room grew still, the silence vibrating like a held breath. I read the rest slowly, each syllable like a heartbeat. She gave me her trust, and tonight, I give that trust back to every artist waiting for a chance to be seen. This foundation is not mine. It is ours. Applause erupted, echoing off the walls, until it felt like the building itself was applauding with them. My chest ached with something I had not felt in so long: acceptance, maybe even belonging. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Margaret, elegant in her silver gown, lips pressed into a thin line. Beside her, Ethan shifted, smirking faintly, as if this was all some theatrical show he had already judged. Their presence was like a shadow in the light, but for the first time, it did not consume me. During the intermission, guests approached, shaking my hand, praising the vision, pledging support. James stood nearby, jotting notes, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of a headline that was writing itself. Emily whispered in my ear, "You're owning this, Liv. Look around. They believe in you." A sculptor from Brooklyn told me how funding could finally allow her to rent a studio instead of carving in her kitchen. A violinist shared that his quartet had been rehearsing in basements, dreaming of a stage. Their gratitude poured over me like warmth I had never known from my own family. Margaret approached at last, her heels clicking against the marble, each step sharp. Ethan followed his hand loosely in Sophie's. Margaret's smile was thin, her voice dipped in honey but laced with steel. "Impressive turnout. I didn't think you had it in you." I met her gaze steadily. "Neither did you." Her eyes narrowed, but she said nothing more, only turned back to mingle with donors, though her shoulders stiffened with every clap of applause that broke out around the room. Later, as the lights dimmed for the gala dinner, I looked out over the tables glittering with candles and glassware. The hum of conversation, the flash of cameras, the subtle nods of approval from people who mattered in the city's cultural world. This was the moment Margaret and Ethan had never envisioned for me. When the evening closed, the applause returned louder, fuller, sweeping through the hall until it pressed against my chest and made my eyes sting. Reporters gathered at the exit microphones, ready cameras flashing. Emily touched my shoulder and whispered, "You did it." As we stepped out into the Manhattan night, the cool air wrapped around me. The marquee lights shimmered above the entrance, casting a glow that made the evening feel unreal. Yet as the door shut behind us and the sound of clapping lingered in my ears, I knew it was real. The city stretched before me alive and restless, and for the first time I was not shrinking from it. I was standing in its center, my grandmother's words still echoing in my heart. The weeks after the gala were a blur of headlines, meetings, and late nights at the foundation. But one morning as I walked out of the office, I found Ethan leaning against a black sedan, his tie loose and his face drawn. "Olivia, we need to talk." His voice cracked in a way I had never heard before. I stopped a few feet away, clutching the strap of my bag. "There's nothing left to say, Ethan." He stepped closer, eyes darting around like he was afraid someone would see him. "I made mistakes, but we can fix this. We can start over." The sight of him standing there, the same man who once promised forever, made my stomach twist. But there was no softness left in me for him. "You threw me away the moment you thought I had nothing left to offer. Now I do have something and you want to crawl back." His mouth opened and shut like he wanted to protest, but the silence between us said everything. I turned and walked away, my heels clicking against the pavement, the sound cutting through his quiet pleading. 2 days later, Sophie posted a photo on Instagram, her arm wrapped around the shoulders of a real estate mogul, 20 years older but infinitely richer. The caption stung even me with its cruelty. "Upgrading never felt so easy." The comments swarmed with laughing emojis and thinly veiled jabs at Ethan. By evening, the post had been shared across gossip blogs, his name trending for all the wrong reasons. James called me that night, his voice vibrating with the rush of a journalist's jackpot. "His firm is under fire, Liv. Word is they lost a $5 million contract after a client pulled out." Something about ethics concerns rumors of him double-dealing. It is unraveling fast. I pressed my phone tighter to my ear, staring at the city outside my window. The irony was bitter and perfect. The next morning, I passed a newsstand near Bryant Park and froze. Ethan's face stared back at me from the front page, eyes sunken expression caught in mid-scowl. The headline screamed, "Betrayal costs. Top lawyer, everything." Beneath it, a smaller line carved the knife deeper. Lost his wife, lost his firm, lost his dignity. People walked by buying coffee, skimming headlines, shaking their heads. His downfall was no longer private. It was a spectacle. Later that week, Daniel came to see me, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "Did you see the papers?" He looks destroyed. I nodded, unsure what to say. Daniel shifted uneasily. Part of me feels bad for him, but then I remember how smug he was, how he looked at you like you were dirt. Maybe he needed this. The foundation buzzed with activity donors more eager than ever to attach their names to a cause wrapped in both tragedy and resilience. Meanwhile, Ethan's calls went unanswered. His texts grew desperate, then angry, then pitiful again. One message burned in my memory. "Please just meet me once, I don't know who else to turn to." I did not reply. The crescendo came when James sent me a draft of his latest piece. He had gotten quotes from former partners, colleagues, even clients. Words like betrayal, arrogance, negligence filled the page. The article detailed how contracts evaporated overnight, how investors demanded audits, how Sophie's betrayal left him publicly humiliated. I scrolled to the image he attached. It was the same photo I had seen at the newsstand, Ethan's tired face beneath a headline that sealed his fate. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a glass of water, staring at the printout. Once I would have cried for him. Once I would have wanted to protect him. But the woman who had stood at that gala, who had spoken with her grandmother's words still ringing in her chest, no longer needed to rescue men who had chosen to betray her. When I folded the article and slipped it into a drawer, I felt no triumph, only a cold clarity. His downfall was not my doing. It was the weight of his own choices finally coming down. The world had judged him, and for once, I did not feel guilty for letting it. Outside the window, the city pulsed indifferent to one man's fall. But I could still hear the echo of whispers in every cafe, every boardroom, every family dinner, where his name would now be spoken with pity or disdain. His story had become a warning. And mine, though not yet finished, was no longer written in the shadows of his. I switched off the lamp, leaving the apartment in darkness, the folded paper a silent marker of the line we had crossed and could never return from. The phone buzzed late the next afternoon with a number I didn't recognize, and for a moment I considered letting it ring out, but something in me pressed answer. It was Daniel's voice, shaky, asking if he could come by. Hours later, he stood in my office at the foundation, his suit-wrinkled eyes hollow, as if he hadn't slept. I saw the way his hand trembled when he tried to smooth his tie. He sank into the chair across from me without waiting for an invitation. "I was with Ethan this morning," he said, his voice low. "He brought me along to meet a group of investors, said it would be good for me to watch." I felt my stomach tighten, already bracing. Daniel shook his head slowly, his face flushed with humiliation. "He used your name, Liv. He told them you were backing him, that he could leverage your reputation to secure their deal." My hands curled into fists on the desk, but Daniel's next words cut even deeper. The investor laughed. He said the Carter family had only one name worth mentioning now, and it wasn't Ethan's or mine. It was yours. He said Olivia Carter is the only one with any value left. Daniel's voice cracked, and he looked away ashamed. The silence stretched, broken only by the ticking clock on the wall. I had imagined moments of vindication before, but hearing Daniel admit it wasn't victory. It was heavy, like a weight pressing on both of us. Finally, he met my eyes. "I was wrong, Liv. About everything. About siding with them, about letting you carry all the shame. You didn't deserve any of it." I leaned back, studying him. Daniel had always been the golden boy, the one my parents poured their pride into, and yet now he sat in front of me stripped of that armor. "What do you want from me, Daniel?" My voice came out colder than I intended. He swallowed. "I want a chance to make it right." I thought of Grandma Rose, of the foundation papers in my desk, of her voice telling me to use what she gave me wisely. A part of me wanted to reject him, to throw his past cruelty back in his face. But another part, the part that had walked through storms and still stood, whispered that building something stronger meant choosing who to carry forward. "If you mean it," I said slowly, "then prove it. Help me build this foundation. No more empty words, no more excuses. Work for it. Work with me." His relief was visible, his shoulders sagging as if I had lifted a weight off him. He nodded quickly, eyes wet but unashamed. "You have my word. Whatever it takes." We sat there in silence for a moment, before I extended my hand across the desk. He hesitated only a second before grasping it, his grip firm, his eyes steady on mine. It felt like more than a handshake. It felt like a shift in the ground between us, something breaking and something new being forged. That night after Daniel left, I stood by the window looking out at the city glowing under the early winter dusk. For the first time in years, I felt the faint flicker of possibility with my brother, fragile but real. The years of bitterness and favoritism could not vanish overnight, but the choice to rebuild had been made. I let my hand rest against the glass, the cool surface grounding me. There was still so much to face, storms yet to come. But as I thought of Daniel's words and the firm clasp of his hand, I knew I was no longer entirely alone in this fight. The morning of the funeral broke gray and heavy, the sky over Westchester low, with clouds that looked like they could split open at any second. I arrived early at the chapel, the air sharp with the bite of winter, my black dress clinging uncomfortably to my skin, as if even fabric could sense the weight of the day. Inside, the pews were already filling with relatives, old friends, and people who had known Grandma Rose through her philanthropy. The scent of lilies was overwhelming, almost too sweet, clinging to every corner of the room. I kept my head high as I moved toward the front, where the casket rested beneath a spray of white roses. My hand brushed the wood gently, and for a moment my throat closed. I wanted to say something to her, to whisper one last thank you, but the words refused to come. Instead, I straightened my back and turned to face the room, waiting for the service to begin. The pastor spoke first, his voice low and reverent, recalling her years of generosity, the foundation she had built long before passing it on to me. My chest swelled with pride and sorrow all at once. When he gestured for me to approach the lectern, I rose slowly, clutching the folded paper in my hands. But before I could reach the microphone, I heard the sharp clip of heels against the marble floor. Margaret surged forward, her face set in determination, her dress as immaculate as if she were attending a gala rather than her mother's funeral. She reached the lectern ahead of me, her hand seizing the microphone with a grip so tight her knuckles whitened. She looked directly at me before turning to the crowd. "My daughter doesn't deserve to stand here today," she declared, her voice slicing through the silence like glass shattering. "She is a failure who brought shame to this family, and now she pretends she can speak for Rose." Gasps rippled through the room. My legs stiffened, heat rising into my cheeks, but I stood still, refusing to flinch. The room shifted uneasily until a voice cut through from the middle pew. It was David Hall, Grandma's lawyer, his calm tone laced with authority. "Margaret, that is enough. Rose appointed Olivia as the sole steward of her legacy. Your words dishonor not only your daughter, but the wishes of the woman we gather to honor today." Another voice followed, firm and unshaken. James had risen to his feet, his journalist's notebook still in his hand. He spoke with measured clarity. "We all saw who Rose trusted. She saw strength and fairness where you saw failure. I will not sit quietly while you rewrite her intentions at her funeral." Several older relatives nodded, their whispers swelling into words of disapproval directed at Margaret. One aunt stood, her voice trembling but loud enough. "You always favored Daniel, always belittled Olivia, even when she showed more resilience than anyone." "It ends today." Margaret's lips pressed into a hard line, her grip tightening on the microphone, as if she could hold on to control by sheer force. But the room was turning against her, each murmur adding weight to her collapse. I stepped forward, then my hand resting gently but firmly on the microphone. Her eyes met mine, filled with fury, but I didn't need to fight her. The silence of the room was already against her. She released the microphone reluctantly, her hand trembling as she stepped back. I placed my folded paper on the lectern, though I didn't need to look at it. My voice came steady, though my heart thundered in my chest. "We measure a life not by wealth or by pride, but by the kindness we leave behind and the fairness we show when the world tests us. Grandma Rose lived a life that will be remembered not for titles or possessions, but for the love she gave and the justice she fought for." The words flowed out, not rehearsed, but born from everything she had taught me. I spoke of the nights she sat with me when I was young, teaching me patience, reminding me that dignity came from how we treated others, not how they treated us. I spoke of her belief that even in betrayal and cruelty, one could choose to rise above and become something stronger. When I finished, there was a heartbeat of silence before the sound of hands coming together filled the chapel. It grew until it became a wave of applause, rolling through the pews, echoing against the vaulted ceiling. People rose to their feet, not for me, but for her, for the truth of the life she had lived. I stepped back from the lectern, my throat tight, and for the first time that day, I allowed myself to breathe fully. Margaret sat stiffly in the front row, her face pale, her shoulders drawn in as though the applause itself was a blow she could not withstand. She did not rise, did not clap, only stared ahead at the casket defeated. The service continued, but the balance in the room had shifted. For the first time in my life, I had spoken above my mother's voice and been heard. The sound of the applause lingered in my ears long after I returned to my seat, a steady reminder that the chains of her judgment no longer bound me. As the final hymn faded, I closed my eyes for a moment and whispered the words I had not been able to say before. "Thank you, Grandma." Then I opened them again to face what came next. The days after the funeral moved in slow, heavy waves, yet each morning when I stepped into the offices of the Rose Arts Foundation, the air felt lighter. Papers piled on my desk, meetings filled my calendar, but there was a steadiness in my chest I had never known before. The foundation had grown quickly with new donations arriving after the gala, and with Daniel now by my side, the work no longer felt like carrying a mountain alone. He walked the halls with a humility I had never seen in him, listening instead of speaking first, and in his quiet nods, I recognized the shift of a man learning where his loyalty truly belonged. Margaret, on the other hand, had disappeared from most public gatherings. The woman who once paraded through social events as if she owned every room now lingered on the edges, whispers following her wherever she went. Newspapers covered the scandal of her outburst at the funeral, commentators calling it the final proof of her long-standing cruelty. She had not spoken to me since, and for once I did not feel the familiar ache of needing her voice. The silence was a gift. Ethan's downfall was less subtle. Reports of his firm losing contracts spread across the business sections. The $5 million deal that had been his last hope crumbled after Sophie abandoned him, leaving behind photographs of her on the arm of a wealthy investor splashed across tabloids. His calls to me went unanswered, his messages left unread, until finally he stopped trying. I knew he was drifting, drowning in the mess he had created, but I no longer felt any urge to throw him a rope. At night, when the city lights glimmered through my apartment windows, I often thought back to that first evening in the rain outside Horizon Tech, clutching a box of my belongings with the sting of shame burning in my chest. It felt like another lifetime. Now my days were filled with meetings where artists pitched ideas, community leaders asked for support, and young people walked into the foundation studios with eyes bright with hope. They called me Ms. Carter, not as a dismissal, but as a mark of respect. Each time I heard it, I felt a piece of my broken self knit back together. One afternoon, James stopped by my office with a new article draft. He had been chronicling not just the foundation's progress, but the deeper story behind it. He placed the pages on my desk and gave me that half smile of his. "People need to see not just what you're building, Olivia, but how you got here. They need to understand the difference between revenge and justice." I read his words later that evening, and as the sentences unfurled, I saw myself in a way I never had before. Not as the failure my mother had called me, not as the abandoned wife Ethan left behind, but as someone who had faced every attempt to destroy her and chosen to rise. Daniel and I stood together at the next board meeting, presenting our vision for expanding the Foundation's programs into arts education across New York's public schools. The applause from the board members was genuine, their commitment solid. Afterward, as we walked out into the brisk winter air, Daniel turned to me with eyes that carried both regret and resolve. "You saved me, Liv. Not with money or power, but by giving me a chance to be better." I squeezed his hand, knowing that was all Grandma Rose would have wanted for us. Weeks later, as I prepared to speak at a community event in Harlem, I caught my reflection in a window. The woman staring back at me stood straighter, her eyes clearer, her expression steady. I remembered every word Margaret had spat at me, every moment Ethan had dismissed me, every whisper that had called me less. And yet here I was, not just surviving, but leading, holding in my hands the legacy of a woman who had believed in me when no one else did. When I stepped onto the stage that evening, the crowd greeted me with applause. I thought of the girl who once cried alone in the dark, convinced she had nothing left. I thought of the rain-slicked streets, the betrayal, the silence of rejection. Then I spoke not with bitterness, but with certainty. I told them that success was not about proving someone wrong, but about proving yourself right, about standing tall in the face of those who tried to break you. The applause that followed was not just for me, but for every person in the room who had ever been told they were not enough. And in that moment, I felt the final piece of the puzzle click into place. I had not needed to shout to fight or to destroy. My life itself had become the answer. I walked off stage, my heart steady, knowing the story was no longer just mine, but one that belonged to everyone who carried scars and still chose to stand. This was the true ending, not of failure, but of becoming whole. And it was only the beginning. If this story has touched you, stay with me, because there are more journeys of justice and dignity still to be told.